Chapter 1. Before the Bible, stories pressed in clay. Before Israel told its story, the world was already telling stories about creation, destruction, gods, justice, and survival. The Bible didn't begin that story. It entered it. What we read in Genesis isn't the first version of a flood, a garden, or a tower. It's a memory written in response to older memories shaped by real places and living people. Let's begin where written memory began, between two rivers. East of the land of Canaan, where Israel's story unfolds, lies a wide plain cut through by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This region is called Mesopotamia, meaning between rivers. Today we know it as Iraq, but 5,000 years ago it was home to some of the earliest known cities on earth. Uruk, Nippur, Babylon. These cities were built from sun-baked brick. They stood flat and broad against the horizon, surrounded by canals and grain fields. People here created complex temples, priesthoods, trade routes, and writing. They didn't write with pens on paper. They used styluses to press signs into wet clay. The script they developed was called cuneiform. It was practical, used for business, legal records, and royal decrees, but it also carried stories, myths, laws, prayers. These were stories meant to outlast a generation. One of the most famous is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was said to be a king of Uruk. His story, written long before the Bible, tells of friendship, grief, pride, and the longing to escape death toward the end of the tale. Gilgamesh meets an old man named Utnapishtim. This man tells of a time when the gods decided to flood the earth. He built a great boat. He filled it with animals. He survived. When the waters receded, he released birds to test for dry land. If that sounds familiar, it should. Noah's story in Genesis follows a nearly identical structure. But this isn't about copying, it's about shared memory. Stories passed down across centuries, told by different peoples in different lands, shaped by different hopes. And there's more. The Garden of Eden, for example, is said in Genesis to lie in the east, fed by 4 rivers, 2 of them, the Tigris and Euphrates, are in Mesopotamia. Ancient Sumerian texts tell of divine gardens tended by the gods. Some stories describe a tree of life, a paradise lost, or humans formed from clay and punished for breaking divine boundaries. The structure of Genesis 2 and 3 fits into a long tradition of creation stories. This doesn't mean the Hebrew Bible lacked originality. It means the writers were working with the building blocks of an ancient world. They knew the stories that came before. They responded with their own vision, one that would shape history. We see this again in the story of the Tower of Babel. Babylon, one of Mesopotamia's greatest cities, was known for its massive step towers called ziggurats. These towers rose in layers, with wide foundations and stair-step levels reaching toward the sky. The most famous stood in the center of the city, painted in deep blues, topped with a shrine and said to connect heaven and earth. Genesis 11 tells of a tower built in a great city, where the people spoke one language and tried to make a name for themselves. The result: confusion, scattering, judgment. This wasn't just a tale about arrogance. It was a commentary on empire. The Tower of Babel's story is likely a direct response to Babylon's own claims of greatness. The Bible isn't just repeating old myths. It's engaging with them. Sometimes affirming, sometimes challenging, always reshaping. Even law had a long life before Moses. In the 1700s BCE, Hammurabi ruled Babylon. His laws were carved into a tall black stone and displayed in public. These laws included rules about theft, marriage, property, debt, injury, and punishment. One of them reads, "If a man puts out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out." This principle, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, appears again in Exodus 21. The form is the same, the content is nearly identical. But in the Bible, the law is tied to covenant. It's not just statecraft, it's tied to identity, to justice under God, not just king. The point here isn't that Moses borrowed from Hammurabi. It's that the form of sacred law, legal codes revealed by divine authority, was already common in the region. The Israelites wrote within that structure, but gave it new meaning. So what does all this tell us? It tells us that when the Bible speaks of floods and gardens, towers and laws, it's not doing so in isolation. The world had already spoken. Clay tablets had already preserved generations of myth and law. The early scribes of Israel were not writing in a vacuum. They were writing in conversation with everything around them, borrowing rejecting, revising, affirming. Chapter 1, Part 2. Before the Bible, stories pressed in clay. This doesn't weaken scripture, it roots it in the real world, a world of empires, exile, memory, and meaning. The Bible is unique not because it invented the first flood, the first law, but because it interpreted them through the eyes of a people who believed their God was not just powerful but personal, a God who remembered, who promised, who entered into covenant. Before the scrolls of Israel, there were the tablets of Babylon. Before the priests of Jerusalem, there were the scribes of Sumer. And yet somehow through exile and empire, a new voice emerged, speaking in the language of its time, yet saying something different. The Bible begins here, not at Sinai, not in Jerusalem, but in conversation with stories pressed in clay.